The morning sun cast long shadows across the military base as Sarah Martinez stepped out of the black sedan that had brought her from the airport. She wore a simple civilian outfit, dark jeans, a plain white shirt, and comfortable walking shoes. Her long dark hair was pulled back in a practical ponytail, and she carried only a small backpack over her shoulder. To anyone watching, she looked like just another civilian contractor or perhaps a family member visiting someone on base. Colonel James Richardson was having what he considered a typical Tuesday morning. He had just finished his coffee in the officers' mess hall and was walking across the courtyard when he noticed the young woman standing near the main administration building, looking somewhat lost. She was studying a piece of paper in her hands and glancing around as if trying to get her bearings. Richardson prided himself on maintaining discipline and order on his base. At 52 years old, he had served for nearly 3 decades and had worked his way up through the ranks through what he believed was strict adherence to military protocol and an unwavering belief in hierarchy. He had little patience for civilians who wandered around military installations without proper escorts or clear purposes. The woman appeared to be in her early 30s, and Richardson immediately assumed she was probably someone's wife or girlfriend who had gotten confused about where she was supposed to be. It happened more often than he cared to admit. Family members showing up for visits without proper coordination, getting lost on the sprawling base that housed over 5,000 military personnel. "Excuse me, miss," Richardson called out as he approached her, his voice carrying the authority he had cultivated over years of command. "This is a restricted military installation. You can't just wander around here without proper authorization and an escort." Sarah looked up from her paper and smiled politely. "Good morning, Colonel," she said, noting his rank insignia immediately. "I'm actually supposed to report to the base commander's office. I was just trying to make sure I had the right building." Richardson frowned. Her casual manner irritated him. Most civilians showed more deference when speaking to senior military officers. "The base commander is an extremely busy man," he said curtly. "He doesn't meet with just anyone who shows up asking for him. What exactly is your business here? Are you a contractor? A family member? Because if you're here for a social visit, you need to go through the proper channels at the visitor center." "I understand your concern about protocol," Sarah replied calmly. "But I assure you I'm supposed to be here. I have orders directing me to report to Colonel Henderson this morning." "Orders?" Richardson laughed dismissively. "Miss, civilians don't receive military orders. You might have an appointment or a contract meeting, but let's use the proper terminology. And even if you do have some kind of meeting scheduled, you still need to be escorted by authorized personnel. You can't just walk around a military base unaccompanied." Sarah maintained her composure, though she was beginning to understand what kind of officer she was dealing with. She had encountered his type before, career military men who had become rigid in their thinking and quick to make assumptions based on appearances. "Colonel, I appreciate your attention to security protocols. However, I believe there may be some confusion about my status here." "The only confusion," Richardson said, his voice becoming more stern, "is why you think you can disregard basic military security procedures. I don't know who you think you are or what kind of special treatment you expect, but on my base, everyone follows the same rules. Civilian contractors, family members, politicians, it doesn't matter. Protocol is protocol." What Richardson didn't know, and couldn't have guessed from Sarah's appearance, was that she was Lieutenant Colonel Sarah Martinez, a decorated intelligence officer with over 15 years of distinguished service. She had just completed a highly classified assignment in Eastern Europe that had required her to maintain deep cover for 8 months. The nature of her work meant that her identity and whereabouts had been compartmentalized to the highest levels of military intelligence. Sarah had been operating under multiple false identities for the better part of a year, working to dismantle a network that had been selling sensitive military technology to hostile foreign governments. Her mission had been so sensitive that even her own family believed she was stationed at a desk job in Germany. The successful completion of her operation had resulted in the arrest of 12 individuals and the recovery of stolen technology worth millions of dollars. The orders in her hand directed her to report to Colonel Henderson for debriefing and her next assignment. After months of living as someone else, she was looking forward to returning to her real identity and proper military life. However, She had been instructed to maintain her civilian appearance until after her initial debriefing for security reasons. Listen carefully, Richardson continued, his patience wearing thin. I'm going to walk you back to the visitor center, where you can properly check in and wait for whoever you're supposed to meet to come escort you. This is not a debate. This is how things work on a properly run military installation. Colonel Richardson, Sarah said, reading his name tag. I understand you're trying to do your job, but perhaps we could call Colonel Henderson's office to verify my appointment? That might save us both some time. I'm not calling the base commander to verify every civilian who shows up claiming to have a meeting, Richardson replied sharply. Do you have any idea how busy Colonel Henderson is? He's responsible for this entire installation and thousands of personnel. He doesn't have time to be bothered with verifying appointments for contractors or consultants or whatever you are. Sarah sighed internally. She had hoped to avoid this kind of situation, but she was beginning to realize that Richardson was not going to be reasonable. His attitude suggested he was the type of officer who had become comfortable with his authority and rarely had it questioned. She suspected he was probably effective at his job, but had developed some unfortunate habits regarding how he treated people he perceived as beneath his rank. Colonel, she tried once more. I really think there's been a misunderstanding. If you could just— The only misunderstanding, Richardson interrupted, is your belief that you can walk around here making demands and expecting special treatment. I've been running security on this base for 3 years, and I know every authorized person who should be here today. You're not on any list I've seen. This statement revealed something important to Sarah. Richardson was apparently the deputy base commander in charge of security operations, which explained his authoritative manner and his assumption that he would know about all scheduled appointments. However, her orders came directly from Pentagon intelligence, and her arrival would not have been coordinated through normal base security channels. Colonel Richardson, I respect your position and your responsibility for base security, Sarah said carefully. However, my presence here today was arranged through channels that might not appear on your normal coordination lists. Intelligence operations often require intelligence operations. Richardson laughed derisively. Now you're claiming to be some kind of spy? Miss, I've seen every type of person try to talk their way onto this base with wild stories. You're about the 10th person this month who's claimed to be involved in some kind of classified intelligence work. It's always the same story. Secret missions, special clearances, direct orders from the Pentagon. Do you people think we're idiots? Sarah realized that Richardson's experience with people attempting to gain unauthorized access had made him cynical about any claims that seemed unusual or extraordinary. From his perspective, her story probably did sound similar to the fabrications he had heard from people trying to infiltrate the base or gain access to areas where they didn't belong. I can understand your skepticism, she said. But perhaps we could resolve this by contacting Colonel Henderson's aide-de-camp. He should be able to confirm that I'm expected. We're not contacting anyone, Richardson declared firmly. What we're going to do is walk back to the visitor center right now, where you can go through the proper check-in procedures like everyone else. If you actually have legitimate business here, it will all get sorted out through proper channels. If you don't, then you'll be escorted off the base. Either way, this conversation is over. As he spoke, Richardson gestured for Sarah to walk in the direction of the visitor center. His body language had shifted to what Sarah recognized as a command posture, shoulders back, chin up, expectant of immediate compliance. He was clearly accustomed to having his orders followed without question. Sarah found herself in an interesting position. Her training and instincts told her that the easiest solution would be to simply comply with Richardson's demands and sort everything out through official channels. However, she also knew that her debriefing with Colonel Henderson was time-sensitive and that delays could potentially compromise ongoing operations related to her recently completed mission. Moreover, Richardson's dismissive attitude and his assumptions about her based on her appearance were beginning to genuinely irritate her. She had spent the last 8 months proving herself in extremely dangerous situations, successfully completing a mission that male colleagues had failed to accomplish. The idea that she should now have to prove her legitimacy to an officer who was making judgments based solely on the fact that she was a young woman in civilian clothes struck her as both professionally insulting and personally frustrating. "Colonel Richardson," she said, her voice taking on a slightly firmer tone, "I appreciate your dedication to security, but I'm going to need you to contact Colonel Henderson's office. This is not a request for special treatment or an attempt to circumvent proper procedures. This is a matter of operational necessity. Richardson's eyes narrowed. He was not accustomed to civilians speaking to him in tones that suggested anything other than complete deference. Miss, you seem to be under the impression that you're in a position to make demands or give instructions to senior military officers. Let me be very clear about something. I am a colonel in the United States Army. I have been serving my country for 28 years. I do not take orders from civilians, consultants, contractors, or anyone else who shows up here without proper authorization. Is that understood? I understand your position perfectly, Sarah replied evenly. However, I think you may be misunderstanding mine. I'm not trying to give you orders or circumvent proper authority. I'm simply trying to report for duty as instructed. Report for duty? Richardson scoffed. You're a civilian. Civilians don't report for duty. They report for work, for meetings, for appointments, but they don't report for duty. That terminology is reserved for military personnel. And, frankly, your continued use of military language inappropriately is beginning to suggest that you're either confused about your status or deliberately trying to misrepresent yourself. Sarah realized that the situation was escalating in a way that was becoming counterproductive. Richardson was clearly entrenched in his assumptions and was interpreting everything she said through the filter of his belief that she was a civilian trying to gain unauthorized access or special treatment. His experience and training were actually working against him in this case, as they had given him a framework for understanding situations that didn't account for the reality of her circumstances. At the same time, she was beginning to form her own impressions of Richardson as an officer. His attention to security was commendable, and his unwillingness to make exceptions based on personal appeals showed good judgment in most circumstances. However, his rigidity and his quickness to make assumptions without gathering complete information suggested some significant blind spots in his leadership approach. Colonel, she said, deciding to try a different approach, what would it take to convince you to make one phone call to verify my status? I'm not asking you to compromise security or ignore procedures. I'm asking you to take one simple step that would clarify this entire situation. What it would take, Richardson replied coldly, is for you to stop trying to negotiate with me and start following the instructions you've been given. You're going to walk to the visitor center now, or I'm going to have the military police escort you there. Those are your options. The mention of military police made Sarah realize that the situation was approaching a point where it could become genuinely problematic. Being detained by base security would create complications that could potentially impact not just her debriefing, but other ongoing operations. However, she also knew that backing down completely would likely result in significant delays and would reinforce Richardson's belief that his assumptions had been correct. As she weighed her options, Sarah noticed that their conversation had begun to attract attention from other personnel moving through the area. Several enlisted soldiers had slowed their pace to observe what appeared to be a dispute between their deputy base commander and a civilian. This added another layer of complexity to the situation, as both she and Richardson were now performing their roles in front of an audience. The morning sun was climbing higher, and Sarah knew that Colonel Henderson would be expecting her soon. Her mission debriefing contained information that could impact operations around the world, and every minute of delay potentially created security risks. At the same time, she recognized that Richardson was operating according to his training and experience, even if his assumptions were incorrect. She made a decision that would change everything. Colonel Richardson, Sarah said, her voice taking on a tone of quiet authority that had been absent from their previous exchange. I'm going to give you one final opportunity to contact Colonel Henderson's office before this situation becomes significantly more complicated for both of us. Richardson's eyebrows shot up at what he perceived as an ultimatum from a civilian. Are you threatening me? Because if you think you can intimidate a United States Army colonel, you are seriously mistaken. I've dealt with contractors who think they can throw their weight around, politicians who believe their positions give them special privileges, and corporate executives who assume money equals authority. None of them impressed me, and neither do you. What Richardson didn't realize was that Sarah's voice had changed because she was shifting into the command presence she had developed over 15 years of military service. The casual, accommodating tone she had been using was being replaced by the natural authority of someone who had led troops in combat zones and made life-or-death decisions under pressure. "This is not a threat, Colonel," she replied. "This is a professional courtesy. I am trying to resolve this situation in a way that preserves dignity for both of us and maintains good order and discipline on this installation." "Good order and discipline?" Richardson repeated incredulously. "You're lecturing me about military discipline? Miss, you are completely out of line. The fact that you think you can stand there and lecture a senior military officer about order and discipline while you're trespassing on a military installation shows exactly how delusional you've become." Several more personnel had gathered at a discreet distance, drawn by the increasingly heated exchange. Sarah noticed Staff Sergeant Williams, whom she recognized from his file as one of Richardson's trusted non-commissioned officers, watching the confrontation with growing concern. She also spotted Lieutenant Thompson, a young officer who seemed uncertain about whether he should intervene or remain at a distance. "Colonel Richardson," Sarah said, her patience finally reaching its limits. "I am Lieutenant Colonel Sarah Martinez, United States Army Intelligence. I am reporting for duty following the completion of a classified operation that required me to maintain civilian cover for operational security reasons. My orders direct me to report to Colonel Henderson for debriefing at 0900 hours. It is currently 0830, which means I have 30 minutes to complete my check-in process. I am asking you, as a fellow officer, to contact the base commander's office to verify my identity and status." For a moment, Richardson was stunned into silence. The woman's entire demeanor had shifted dramatically. Her posture, her voice, her manner of speaking. Everything had changed in an instant from that of an uncertain civilian to something that unmistakably resembled military bearing. However, his skepticism quickly reasserted itself. "Lieutenant Colonel," he laughed, but there was less confidence in his laughter than before. "Right? And I suppose you're going to tell me that you're some kind of Special Forces operator or Navy SEAL next. Miss, I don't know what kind of movies you've been watching or what kind of fantasy you're living in, but impersonating a military officer is a federal crime. You're in serious trouble now." Sarah reached into her backpack and pulled out a military identification card, which she held out for Richardson to examine. "My identification, Colonel. I believe you'll find everything in order." Richardson took the ID card with obvious skepticism, expecting to find some kind of civilian contractor identification or perhaps a fake military ID. What he saw instead made his confident expression falter. The identification appeared to be completely authentic, standard military format, proper security features, current photograph matching the woman in front of him, and rank listed as Lieutenant Colonel. However, Richardson was not ready to accept what he was seeing. "Anyone can get fake IDs made these days," he said, though his voice lacked its previous certainty. "The fact that you have something that looks official doesn't prove anything. Military identification has specific security features that would be impossible to replicate." "Then, perhaps you should examine those security features more carefully," Sarah suggested quietly. As Richardson studied the ID more closely, he began to notice details that would be extremely difficult to fake. The holographic elements were correct, the magnetic stripe appeared authentic, and the cardstock felt exactly like genuine military identification. More troubling for his theory, the photograph was clearly professional military photography, and the identification number format was current and accurate. Staff Sergeant Williams approached hesitantly. "Sir, is everything all right? Some of the troops are starting to wonder if they should assist." Richardson looked up from the ID card, clearly struggling with what he was seeing. "Stand by, Sergeant Williams. I'm verifying some information." "Colonel Richardson," Sarah said, "I understand this situation is unusual. My operational requirements meant that my presence here today could not be coordinated through normal channels. However, a simple phone call to Colonel Henderson's aide will confirm everything I've told you. I'm not asking you to compromise security or take my word for anything. I'm asking you to verify information through proper military channels." For the first time since their encounter began, Richardson seemed genuinely uncertain. The ID appeared authentic. The woman's demeanor had shifted to something unmistakably military, and her knowledge of proper terminology and protocol was more extensive than he would expect from a civilian impersonator. However, admitting that he might have been wrong would be professionally embarrassing, especially in front of his subordinates. Even if this identification is authentic, he said slowly, you're still in violation of proper check-in procedures. Military personnel are required to report through the same channels as everyone else. You should have gone to the visitor center first, regardless of your rank or status. Sarah recognized what Richardson was doing, trying to maintain his position of authority by focusing on procedural issues rather than acknowledging his fundamental error in judgment. It was a face-saving maneuver that she could either accept graciously or challenge directly. Colonel, she said, under normal circumstances, you would be absolutely correct about check-in procedures. However, my orders specify that I report directly to the base commander due to the sensitive nature of my debriefing. The operational security requirements of my previous assignment necessitate limiting the number of personnel who are aware of my presence and identity until after my initial meeting with Colonel Henderson. This explanation made operational sense, and Richardson knew it. Highly classified operations often required unusual protocols to maintain security. However, accepting Sarah's explanation would require him to admit that his initial assumptions had been completely wrong, and that his treatment of her had been inappropriate. Lieutenant Thompson approached the group cautiously. "Excuse me, sir?" Colonel Henderson's aide called looking for someone who was supposed to report this morning. He asked if we had seen anyone who might be here for a classified debriefing. The timing of this information was perfect from Sarah's perspective and devastating from Richardson's. It corroborated everything she had been saying and made it clear that she was indeed expected by the base commander. Richardson's face began to redden as the implications became clear. Did the aide provide any specifics about who they were expecting? Richardson asked, though he clearly suspected what the answer would be. He said they were expecting a lieutenant colonel from intelligence who might not be in uniform due to operational requirements, Thompson replied. He asked us to contact his office immediately if we encountered anyone matching that description. Sarah maintained her professional composure, but she could see that Richardson was beginning to understand the magnitude of his error. Not only had he been wrong about her identity and status, but his refusal to make a simple verification phone call had created exactly the kind of delay and confusion that operational security protocols were designed to prevent. I believe that would be me, Sarah said calmly. Perhaps we should contact Colonel Henderson's office now. Richardson was trapped. Every instinct told him that he needed to maintain his authority and control of the situation, but the evidence was mounting that he had made a serious mistake. Worse, his mistake was becoming public, observed by subordinates who looked to him for leadership and good judgment. Sergeant Williams, he said stiffly, contact Colonel Henderson's aide and inform him that we have located the officer who was expected for debriefing. Yes, sir, Williams replied, pulling out his radio. Within moments, he had established contact with the base commander's office. The conversation was brief, but illuminating. Sir, Williams reported. The aide confirms that Lieutenant Colonel Martinez is expected immediately for a priority debriefing. He's asked me to escort her directly to the commander's office and to expedite her arrival. The confirmation hit Richardson like a physical blow. Not only had he been completely wrong about Sarah's identity, but he had delayed a priority meeting with the base commander. The operational implications of his actions were beginning to dawn on him, and he realized that his reputation for good judgment and military competence had just taken a serious hit. Sarah watched Richardson process this information and felt a mixture of vindication and professional sympathy. She had been in similar situations where good officers had made errors in judgment, and she understood the personal and professional consequences he was now facing. Colonel Richardson, she said quietly, mistakes happen. The important thing now is to move forward professionally and ensure that operational requirements are met. Her gracious response surprised Richardson. He had expected her to be angry, vindictive, or at least coldly professional. Instead, she was offering him a way to salvage some dignity from the situation. However, his pride was wounded, and his first instinct was defensive. This entire situation could have been avoided if proper procedures had been followed from the beginning, he said. Intelligence operations shouldn't be conducted in ways that circumvent standard security protocols. It creates confusion and operational risks. Sarah recognized that Richardson was trying to shift responsibility for the incident away from his own assumptions and onto the operational requirements that had necessitated her civilian appearance. While there was some validity to his point about the challenges created by unusual protocols, his statement also revealed that he was not prepared to accept full responsibility for his role in the situation. You raise a valid point about the challenges of balancing operational security with standard procedures, she replied diplomatically. However, the protocols for my arrival were established by Pentagon intelligence based on the specific requirements of my previous mission. Those decisions were made at levels well above both of our pay grades. This response effectively ended Richardson's ability to argue about the appropriateness of the procedures without questioning the judgment of senior military leadership. He was an experienced enough officer to recognize when he was in a losing position, but his ego was preventing him from gracefully accepting the situation. Staff Sergeant Williams cleared his throat diplomatically. "Ma'am, Colonel Henderson's aide emphasized that your meeting is time-sensitive. Would you like me to escort you to the commander's office now?" "Thank you, Sergeant Williams," Sarah replied. "That would be very helpful." She turned back to Richardson. "Colonel, I appreciate your attention to base security. I'm sure we'll have opportunities to work together professionally in the future." Again, Sarah was offering Richardson a gracious exit from the situation. Her comments suggested that she viewed their encounter as a professional misunderstanding rather than a personal conflict, and that she harbored no ill will toward him. For an experienced officer, this was about the best possible outcome he could hope for given the circumstances. However, Richardson's response would reveal much about his character and his ability to learn from mistakes. Some officers would have accepted Sarah's diplomatic approach and moved forward professionally. Others would allow their wounded pride to compound their initial error in judgment. "Lieutenant Colonel Martinez," Richardson said formally, his voice tight with barely controlled emotion. "I hope your debriefing with Colonel Henderson goes well. I'm sure your unconventional operational methods will be thoroughly discussed." The emphasis he placed on unconventional, and his tone suggested that Richardson was not prepared to simply accept the situation and move forward. Instead, he seemed to be implying that there were still questions about the appropriateness of Sarah's methods or the legitimacy of her mission. Sarah's eyes hardened slightly. She had offered Richardson multiple opportunities to handle the situation professionally, and he had consistently chosen to maintain his confrontational approach. His latest comment crossed the line from professional disagreement to something that bordered on insubordination, given that he was essentially questioning intelligence operations authorized at the highest levels of military command. "Colonel Richardson," she said, her voice taking on the ice-cold tone of a superior officer addressing inappropriate behavior. "I'm going to assume that your comment was poorly chosen rather than deliberately insubordinate. However, I would suggest that you carefully consider your next words." The change in Sarah's demeanor was subtle but unmistakable. Sergeant Williams and Lieutenant Thompson both recognized the tone of a senior officer who was running out of patience with a subordinate's behavior. More importantly, Richardson himself recognized it, even though his wounded pride was preventing him from responding appropriately. The morning sun was now fully overhead, and other personnel were beginning to take notice of the prolonged confrontation. What had started as a simple misunderstanding was threatening to become a significant incident that could have lasting repercussions for everyone involved. The question now was whether Richardson would finally choose to handle the situation professionally, or whether his pride would lead him to make an even more serious error in judgment that could damage his career and reputation permanently. Richardson stood frozen for a moment, caught between his wounded pride and the growing realization that he was digging himself into a deeper hole with each word he spoke. The warning in Sarah's voice was unmistakable, and even through his anger and embarrassment, he recognized that he was approaching a line that, once crossed, could have serious consequences for his career. However, before he could formulate a response, Lieutenant Thompson's radio crackled to life with an incoming transmission from Colonel Henderson's office. "All units, this is Base Command. We have a priority security alert. Lieutenant Colonel Sarah Martinez, expected for classified debriefing, is now 15 minutes overdue. All security personnel are to assist in locating this officer immediately. Any delays in her arrival could compromise ongoing operations. Base Command out." The radio transmission hit the assembled group like a thunderbolt. Not only was Sarah exactly who she claimed to be, but Richardson's delays had now created a security situation that was being broadcast base-wide. The implication that ongoing operations could be compromised made it clear that Sarah's debriefing was far more critical than anyone had realized. Sergeant Williams looked pale as he absorbed the implications. Lieutenant Thompson appeared to be struggling with whether he should say something or remain silent. Most tellingly, Richardson himself seemed to finally understand the full magnitude of what his assumptions and stubbornness had created. "Sergeant Williams," Sarah said calmly, "please contact Base Command immediately and inform them that I am en route to Colonel Henderson's office. Tell them the delay was due to security verification procedures and that I will be there within 5 minutes." "Yes, ma'am," Williams replied, immediately reaching for his radio. His relief at having clear, direct orders from someone who obviously knew what they were doing was evident in his voice. Sarah turned to Richardson, who was standing silently, his face now drained of color as he processed what had just happened. "Colonel Richardson, we need to discuss this situation privately after my debriefing is complete. I suggest you use the next hour to consider how you want to explain today's events to Colonel Henderson, because I can guarantee you that he will be asking questions." The quiet authority in her voice left no doubt that this was not a suggestion, but an order, despite the fact that their relative ranks had not yet been officially established through the chain of command. Richardson nodded stiffly, unable to trust his voice to respond appropriately. As Sarah walked away toward the administration building, escorted by Sergeant Williams, Richardson was left standing with Lieutenant Thompson and several enlisted personnel who had witnessed the entire confrontation. The young lieutenant seemed uncertain about whether he should say something to his superior officer or pretend the incident had never happened. "Sir," Thompson ventured carefully, "should I prepare a report on the security verification procedures that caused the delay?" Richardson looked at him sharply, recognizing the diplomatic lifeline the junior officer was offering. Thompson was giving him an opportunity to frame the incident as a routine security check rather than a personal confrontation based on mistaken assumptions. However, Richardson was an experienced enough officer to know that any report he filed would be compared against Sarah's account of events, and any discrepancies would only make his situation worse. "No report necessary, Lieutenant," he replied quietly. "This was an internal matter that will be resolved through proper channels." Meanwhile, Sarah was walking quickly toward Colonel Henderson's office, her mind already shifting from the confrontation with Richardson to the critical briefing she needed to deliver. However, she couldn't entirely dismiss what had just occurred. Richardson's behavior revealed some concerning attitudes about authority, respect, and professional judgment that could impact his effectiveness as a leader. More troubling was the realization that if Richardson was willing to be so dismissive and confrontational with someone he believed was a civilian, his treatment of actual civilian contractors, family members, and other non-military personnel was probably problematic. His attitude suggested a pattern of behavior that could create serious issues for the base's relationships with the local community and civilian support personnel. Sergeant Williams matched her pace as they approached the administration building. "Ma'am, if you don't mind me asking, what kind of operation were you returning from? I've never seen anything quite like what just happened back there." Sarah glanced at him, noting the genuine curiosity and respect in his voice. "I'm sorry, Sergeant, but I can't discuss operational details. However, I can tell you that sometimes intelligence work requires people to be other than what they appear to be. It's unfortunate when that creates misunderstandings with good soldiers who are just trying to do their jobs." Williams nodded, understanding that he wouldn't get specifics, but appreciating that she had acknowledged the complexity of the situation. "For what it's worth, ma'am, Colonel Richardson is usually a good officer. He takes base security very seriously, maybe sometimes too seriously. I think today just caught him off guard." Sarah appreciated Williams's attempt to defend his superior officer, even after witnessing Richardson's poor judgment. It spoke well of the sergeant's loyalty and character. "I'm sure Colonel Richardson has many fine qualities as an officer, Sergeant. Today was just an unfortunate situation that got out of hand." As they entered the administration building, Sarah's thoughts turned to the more immediate challenge of explaining to Colonel Henderson why her arrival had been delayed. The base commander would certainly want to understand what had caused a priority intelligence briefing to be disrupted, and she would need to provide an accurate account without unnecessarily damaging Richardson's reputation. Colonel Henderson's aide, Major Patricia Collins, was waiting in the outer office, clearly agitated about the delay. Lieutenant Colonel Martinez? Thank God you're here. Colonel Henderson has been asking about your arrival every 5 minutes. There are 3 different operations that are waiting for your debriefing information before they can proceed. My apologies for the delay, Major Collins, Sarah replied. There was a security verification issue that took longer than expected to resolve. Is Colonel Henderson ready to begin the briefing now? He's been ready for 20 minutes, Collins said, leading Sarah toward the commander's office. I hope the security issue wasn't anything serious? Sarah paused at the door to Henderson's office. Nothing that can't be resolved through proper military channels, Major. The important thing is to get this briefing completed so that ongoing operations can proceed. Collins knocked on the door and announced Sarah's arrival. A firm voice from inside called for them to enter, and Sarah stepped into the office of the base commander. Colonel Henderson was a tall, lean man in his early 50s with graying hair and the bearing of someone who had commanded at every level of military service. His office was spartanly decorated, with only essential furniture and a few commendations on the walls. He stood as Sarah entered and immediately gestured for her to take a seat across from his desk. Lieutenant Colonel Martinez, he said without preamble, I'm glad you're finally here. Your delay has caused some concern at multiple levels of command. I hope there wasn't a problem with your travel arrangements or security clearances. Sarah sat down and met Henderson's gaze directly. No, sir, my travel was completed without incident. However, I did encounter a situation during my arrival on base that resulted in a delay. One of your officers challenged my presence here and required additional time to verify my identity and authorization. Henderson's eyebrows rose slightly. Challenged your presence? Can you elaborate on that, Lieutenant Colonel? Sarah found herself in a delicate position. She needed to provide Henderson with accurate information about what had caused the delay, but she also didn't want to unnecessarily damage Richardson's career over what could be characterized as an honest mistake. However, she also couldn't ignore the fact that Richardson's behavior had revealed some concerning patterns that Henderson might need to address. Sir, Colonel Richardson encountered me outside the administration building and assumed I was a civilian visitor who was wandering around the base without proper authorization. When I attempted to explain my status and mission, he was skeptical and insisted on treating me as a security risk rather than verifying my identity through proper channels. Henderson leaned back in his chair, his expression becoming more serious. Colonel Richardson is my deputy base commander and chief of security. He's generally quite good at his job, but he can sometimes be overly zealous in his approach to security matters. How long did this verification process take? Approximately 25 minutes, sir. During that time, Colonel Richardson repeatedly refused to contact your office to verify my appointment, despite my requests that he do so. He insisted that I must be a civilian attempting to gain unauthorized access and threatened to have me escorted off base by military police. Henderson's expression darkened. 25 minutes? Lieutenant Colonel, your debriefing contains information that impacts operations on 3 continents. Every minute of delay creates potential security risks and operational complications. This is completely unacceptable. Sarah could see that Henderson was becoming genuinely angry about the situation, which was exactly what she had hoped to avoid. Sir, I believe Colonel Richardson was acting according to his training and experience. The situation was unusual, and his security protocols are generally sound. However, there were some aspects of his approach that might benefit from review. Such as, Henderson asked, his tone indicating that he wanted specifics. Sarah knew she was approaching a point where she would have to be more direct about Richardson's behavior or risk being seen as evasive by her commanding officer. Sir, Colonel Richardson's initial assumption that I was a civilian was understandable given my appearance. However, when I provided my military identification and requested that he verify my appointment with your office, he refused to consider that his assumptions might be incorrect. More concerning was his attitude towards someone he believed was a civilian. He was dismissive, condescending, and seemed to take pleasure in asserting his authority. Henderson nodded slowly. I see. And how was the situation finally resolved? One of your staff officers, Lieutenant Thompson, mentioned that your aide had called looking for someone expected for a classified debriefing. This information, combined with radio confirmation from your office, finally convinced Colonel Richardson that I was who I claimed to be. So he required independent confirmation from multiple sources before accepting your identification and status, Henderson summarized. That suggests either very poor judgment or a systematic problem with how he processes information that doesn't fit his preconceptions. Sarah was beginning to realize that her attempt to minimize the impact on Richardson's career might be counterproductive. Henderson was an experienced commander who understood the implications of what she was describing, and her diplomatic language wasn't hiding the seriousness of the situation. Sir, I believe Colonel Richardson is probably an effective officer in most circumstances. However, today's incident suggests that he may have some blind spots in his leadership approach that could benefit from attention. Henderson stood up and walked to the window overlooking the base courtyard. Lieutenant Colonel Martinez, I appreciate your diplomatic approach to this situation. However, I need you to understand something. Colonel Richardson's behavior this morning didn't just delay your debriefing. It potentially compromised multiple ongoing operations. Moreover, his treatment of someone he believed was a civilian reflects on this entire command and could create serious problems with our community relationships. Sarah remained silent, recognizing that Henderson was working through the broader implications of the incident. Furthermore, Henderson continued, the fact that he refused to make a simple verification phone call suggests a level of rigid thinking that could be dangerous in a military environment. Good officers need to be able to adapt their thinking when presented with new information. What you're describing sounds like someone who was more concerned with being right than with accomplishing the mission. Henderson turned back to face Sarah. I'm going to need a detailed written report on this incident, including your assessment of Colonel Richardson's decision-making process and leadership approach. This kind of behavior cannot be allowed to continue, especially not from someone in a senior leadership position. Sarah nodded, understanding that her hope of resolving the situation quietly had been unrealistic. Yes, sir. I'll prepare a complete report after we finish the operational debriefing. Good, Henderson said, returning to his desk. Now, let's get to the matter that brought you here. I understand you have information that's critical to several ongoing operations. As Sarah began her debriefing on the intelligence operation she had just completed, she couldn't help but think about Richardson and the consequences he would likely face as a result of his poor judgment. She had tried to handle the situation diplomatically, but his behavior had created problems that extended far beyond their personal confrontation. The irony was not lost on her that Richardson's rigid adherence to what he thought were proper procedures had actually resulted in a serious breach of operational security and military discipline. His refusal to adapt his thinking when presented with new information had created exactly the kind of problems that good military procedures were designed to prevent. As she provided Henderson with detailed intelligence about the network she had helped dismantle in Eastern Europe, Sarah wondered whether Richardson would learn from this experience or whether his wounded pride would lead him to blame others for his mistakes. The answer to that question would likely determine whether he could salvage his career and reputation from the damage he had inflicted on himself through his assumptions and stubbornness. The debriefing with Colonel Henderson lasted nearly 2 hours and covered intelligence that would impact military operations across multiple theaters. Sarah provided detailed information about the technology theft network she had infiltrated, the foreign agents involved, and the methods they had used to compromise American military systems. Her work had prevented millions of dollars in further losses and had identified security vulnerabilities that were already being addressed at the Pentagon level. When the operational briefing concluded, Henderson leaned back in his chair and studied Sarah carefully. Lieutenant Colonel Martinez, your work on this operation was exceptional. The intelligence you gathered has already led to arrests in 3 countries and has helped us plug security leaks that we didn't even know existed. Your country owes you a debt of gratitude. Thank you, sir, Sarah replied. I was just doing my job. No, Henderson said firmly. You were doing much more than that. The risks you took and the sacrifices you made went well beyond normal duty requirements, which makes this morning's incident with Colonel Richardson even more problematic. An officer who has served with such distinction should never have been subjected to the kind of treatment you experienced today. Henderson stood and moved to his desk, where he began writing in a folder. I've decided to address the Richardson situation immediately. His behavior this morning demonstrates judgment problems that could impact the effectiveness of this entire command. I'm relieving him of his security responsibilities pending a full review of his leadership approach and decision-making processes. Sarah felt a complex mix of emotions at this announcement. While she believed that Richardson's behavior had been inappropriate and potentially dangerous, she also knew that ending an officer's career was a serious matter that would affect not just him but his family and all the soldiers under his command. "Sir," she said carefully, "I hope my report won't be the only factor in your decision regarding Colonel Richardson. He may be an effective leader in other areas, and today's incident might not be representative of his overall performance." Henderson looked at her with what might have been surprise. "Lieutenant Colonel, you're being remarkably generous towards someone who treated you quite poorly. However, I appreciate your professional approach. You're right that one incident shouldn't define an officer's entire career. That's why I'm ordering a comprehensive review rather than taking immediate disciplinary action." He returned to his seat and fixed Sarah with a direct gaze. "However, I want you to understand something. Colonel Richardson's behavior this morning wasn't just unprofessional, it was dangerous. His refusal to verify information or adapt his thinking could have compromised your identity and put you at risk. Moreover, his attitude toward civilians could create serious problems for this base's community relations." Sarah nodded, understanding Henderson's position. "I agree that the incident raises concerns that need to be addressed. I just hope that any corrective action takes into account his full record of service." "It will," Henderson assured her. "But change has to start somewhere, and sometimes it takes a significant incident to reveal patterns of behavior that have been developing over time. I suspect that if I dig deeper, I'll find that Richardson's rigid thinking and poor interpersonal skills have been causing problems for a while." As if summoned by their conversation, there was a knock on Henderson's office door. Major Collins announced that Colonel Richardson was requesting an immediate meeting with the base commander. Henderson glanced at Sarah, then instructed Collins to send Richardson in. Richardson entered the office and immediately saw Sarah sitting across from Henderson's desk. His face tightened, but he maintained military bearing as he approached and saluted the base commander. "Sir," Richardson began, "I need to discuss this morning's incident involving Lieutenant Colonel Martinez. I believe there may have been some misunderstandings about what transpired, and I wanted to provide you with my account of events before any official reports are filed." Henderson returned Richardson's salute and gestured for him to remain standing. The fact that he didn't offer Richardson a seat was not lost on anyone in the room. It was a clear signal that this would be a formal discussion rather than a collegial conversation between senior officers. "Colonel Richardson," Henderson said coldly, "I've already received Lieutenant Colonel Martinez's account of this morning's events. I've also spoken with Staff Sergeant Williams, Lieutenant Thompson, and Major Collins about the operational delays that resulted from your actions. Unless you're here to tell me that multiple witnesses have completely mischaracterized what happened, I'm not sure what misunderstandings you think need to be clarified." Richardson's confident expression faltered slightly. He had clearly hoped to present his version of events before Henderson heard from other sources. Now he was in the position of having to contradict established facts rather than establishing the narrative himself. "Sir, I was conducting standard security verification procedures with someone who appeared to be an unauthorized civilian on base. My actions were entirely consistent with established security protocols and my responsibilities as deputy base commander." Sarah watched Richardson carefully, noting that he was still characterizing their encounter as a routine security check rather than acknowledging his assumptions and poor judgment. His unwillingness to accept responsibility for his mistakes suggested that Henderson's concerns about his thinking patterns were well-founded. "Colonel Richardson," Henderson replied, "Lieutenant Colonel Martinez provided proper military identification and repeatedly requested that you verify her appointment with my office. According to multiple witnesses, you refused to make a simple phone call that would have resolved the situation immediately. How exactly do you characterize that as standard procedure?" Richardson's jaw tightened. "Sir, military identification can be forged, and unauthorized individuals frequently attempt to gain access by claiming to have appointments or meetings. My experience has taught me to be skeptical of unusual circumstances and to verify information through multiple sources." Your skepticism delayed a priority intelligence briefing by 25 minutes, Henderson said sharply. That delay potentially compromised operations in 3 different theaters and required emergency coordination with Pentagon intelligence to mitigate security risks. Your standard procedures created exactly the kind of operational problems that good security is supposed to prevent. Sarah could see that Richardson was struggling to find a response that would justify his actions without directly contradicting his commanding officer. His defensive posture suggested that he still didn't fully understand the magnitude of his error or its implications. "Sir," Richardson said slowly, "I understand that the delay was unfortunate. However, I believe my caution was justified given the unusual circumstances and the potential security risks of allowing unauthorized personnel access to sensitive areas." Henderson stood up abruptly, his patience clearly exhausted. Colonel Richardson, Lieutenant Colonel Martinez was not unauthorized personnel. She was a decorated intelligence officer reporting for duty following the successful completion of a highly classified operation. Your failure to recognize this, and your refusal to verify her status through proper channels demonstrates such poor judgment that I'm questioning your fitness for your current position. The bluntness of Henderson's statement hit Richardson like a physical blow. His face went pale as he realized that his career was potentially in jeopardy. For the first time since entering the office, he seemed to understand that this was not a minor administrative matter that could be explained away. "Sir," he said, his voice now showing the first signs of uncertainty, "I may have made some errors in judgment this morning. However, my overall record of service and my commitment to this command's security should be taken into consideration." Henderson nodded slowly. "Your record will absolutely be taken into consideration, Colonel. That's why I'm ordering a comprehensive review of your performance and leadership approach rather than taking immediate disciplinary action. However, I'm also relieving you of security responsibilities effective immediately, pending the outcome of that review." Richardson's shoulders sagged slightly as the full implications of Henderson's decision became clear. Being relieved of major responsibilities was a serious career setback that would be noted in his permanent record and would likely impact any future promotion opportunities. "I understand, sir," he said quietly. "May I ask who will be assuming my security duties?" "Lieutenant Colonel Martinez will be taking over security operations temporarily while I identify a permanent replacement," Henderson replied. Her intelligence background and demonstrated judgment make her well suited for the position. Sarah felt a moment of surprise at this unexpected assignment, but she recognized the logic behind Henderson's decision. Her intelligence training had given her extensive experience with security operations, and taking over Richardson's duties would demonstrate confidence in her abilities while providing practical resolution to the leadership gap Richardson's removal would create. Richardson's reaction to this news was immediate and visceral. The idea that the woman he had dismissed and mistreated just hours earlier was now being placed in his former position was clearly devastating to his professional pride. However, his response would reveal much about his character and his ability to learn from his mistakes. "Sir," he said, his voice tight with barely controlled emotion, "I question the wisdom of placing someone with no familiarity with this base's specific security requirements in such a critical position. Lieutenant Colonel Martinez may be qualified in general terms, but she lacks the institutional knowledge and relationships necessary to be effective." Henderson's expression became dangerous. "Colonel Richardson, are you questioning my judgment regarding personnel assignments?" Richardson realized immediately that he had made another serious error. Questioning a superior officer's decisions, especially in front of witnesses, was a form of insubordination that could result in formal disciplinary action. However, his wounded pride had overcome his professional judgment once again. "No, sir," he said quickly. "I was simply expressing concerns about operational continuity." "Your concerns are noted," Henderson said coldly. "However, given that your own judgment regarding Lieutenant Colonel Martinez proved to be so dramatically flawed, I'm not sure your assessment of her qualifications carries much weight." The dismissive tone of Henderson's response made it clear that Richardson's credibility with his commanding officer had been seriously damaged. Sarah could see that he was struggling with the humiliation of being professionally diminished in front of someone he had earlier treated with such disrespect. "Colonel Richardson," Henderson continued, "you're dismissed. Report to Major Collins tomorrow morning to discuss your reassignment to administrative duties pending the completion of your performance review. Richardson saluted stiffly and turned to leave. As he reached the door, he paused and looked back at Sarah. For a moment, she thought he might apologize or acknowledge his mistakes. Instead, his expression hardened into something that suggested he still viewed her as somehow responsible for his current predicament. Lieutenant Colonel Martinez, he said formally, I hope you find the security position educational. The passive-aggressive tone of his comment was unmistakable, and it confirmed Sarah's assessment that Richardson had not learned from the morning's events. Instead of accepting responsibility for his poor judgment, he seemed to be blaming her for the consequences of his own actions. After Richardson left, Henderson turned to Sarah with an expression that mixed frustration with resignation. Well, that confirmed my concerns about Colonel Richardson's judgment and leadership approach. His inability to accept responsibility for his mistakes and his passive-aggressive response to authority make it clear that more serious intervention is necessary. Sarah nodded, though she felt some sympathy for Richardson despite his behavior. Sir, losing a command position is a serious setback for any officer. His reaction might improve once he has time to process what happened and reflect on his mistakes. Perhaps, Henderson replied. However, his performance will be evaluated based on his actions, not his potential for future improvement. Right now, he's demonstrated poor judgment, rigid thinking, inability to accept responsibility, and passive-aggressive responses to authority. Those are not qualities I want in a senior leadership position. Henderson returned to his desk and pulled out a folder. Lieutenant Colonel Martinez, I want to discuss your new responsibilities. Taking over base security operations is a significant assignment, and I want to ensure you have everything you need to be successful. As they began planning Sarah's transition into her new role, she reflected on the strange turn of events that had brought her from a confrontation in the courtyard to a position of significant responsibility on the base. Richardson's assumptions about her qualifications and status had not only been wrong, they had been so dramatically wrong that his errors had created the very opportunity for her to demonstrate her capabilities in his former position. The irony was not lost on her that Richardson's attempt to assert his authority over someone he viewed as beneath him had ultimately resulted in that person being placed in a position of authority over areas he had previously controlled. His rigid thinking and poor judgment had created exactly the outcome he would have wanted to avoid. Over the following weeks, Sarah would prove herself to be an exceptionally capable security chief, implementing improvements that enhanced both security and community relations. Her intelligence background and diplomatic approach would make her popular with both military personnel and civilian contractors. Meanwhile, Richardson's performance review would reveal a pattern of similar incidents involving poor judgment and problematic interpersonal skills. The incident in the courtyard that morning had lasted less than an hour, but its consequences would shape both of their careers for years to come. Richardson's assumptions and pride had cost him a position he had held for 3 years, while Sarah's professionalism and competence had earned her recognition and advancement she had never expected. In the end, the morning had proven that appearances could indeed be deceiving, but not in the way Richardson had initially assumed. The real deception had been his belief that authority came from rank and position rather than from competence, judgment, and character. Sarah had demonstrated all 3 qualities under pressure, while Richardson had revealed deficiencies in each area when tested. The base would be better served by the change in leadership. The security operations would be more effective under Sarah's management, and the incident would serve as a valuable lesson for other officers about the dangers of making assumptions based on appearances. For Richardson, however, the morning's events would remain a painful reminder of how quickly poor judgment and wounded pride could derail a military career that had taken decades to build.